Hello, Mrs. Johnston here, and it is knowledge and science and social studies time. We are beginning a new unit, number 10, called Colonial Towns and Townspeople. We are on the very first lesson called the Country Family. Before we begin this unit, though, we need to go over some important information. Over the next few weeks, you will be learning about what life was like in America 100 or hundreds of years ago. Hundreds of years ago, people made most of what they needed at home. Living back then meant doing a lot of work, and even the children had to help by doing chores every day. Do you have any chores at home? Have you ever helped cook dinner or taken care of the pets? Today's read aloud will describe a lot of the chores a family would have done hundreds of years ago on a farm in the country. Over the next few days, you will be learning about towns or places where farmers could go to buy things that would make life easier. Where are some places you might go now to get food or clothes? Did you say Walmart, Meijer, maybe Family Fair to get food? Maybe you drive to Traverse City and go to Target or Kohl's. Those are some brand name stores where you might get clothes or food. Hundreds of years ago, there were only a few kinds of stores called shops, and they were only found in towns, which could sometimes be very far from a farmer's house. Farmers liked going to town because tradespeople made and sold things farmers needed, so they didn't have to make them at home. A farmer went to town for a lot of the same reasons we go to the stores today. Over the next few weeks, you will learn about tradespeople, people who had special jobs like making clothes or building houses. I will help you make a timeline of key events in American history to help identify the time period that you are going to be reading about. The colonial times and townspeople in our read alouds takes place in the 1700s. Remember that from our last unit, the last plot on our timeline was 1620s. We have also learned about Native Americans in our Native Americans domain. The Native Americans will come up in our stories in this unit as well. Did Native Americans live in America before Columbus and the European settlers arrived? Yes, Native Americans lived in America for hundreds of years. Did all tribes move around frequently? Many tribes were nomadic, meaning that they moved frequently, finding new hunting grounds, looking for new sources of fish or vegetation, and moving when the seasons changed. Other tribes settled in one location, developing large farming communities that became large towns over time. When European explorers like Columbus came, they set up settlements in which they stayed in each time they came to claim the lands and goods on their voyages. But many of these settlements were temporary and didn't last. Years later, other groups of Europeans, like pilgrims, sailed to America to stay and live here permanently. The Native Americans continued to live in America on lands near these colonies, but they didn't live in the same kinds of towns that European Americans did. The first towns established by European settlers were small, with a few common buildings and land to grow crops. As the years passed, more colonies were established along the east coast of America. Farms and the towns grew larger. The people who lived there grew to depend more on each other for the things that they needed. The colonial towns that you will read about were formed in the early 1700s when these colonies were still under English rule. Who can tell me what are timelines used for? Timelines are used to show when events took place in history. Listen carefully to the read aloud today to identify the chores that children had to do long ago in colonial times if they lived on a farm. Today, we are going to take an imaginary trip back in time, about 300 years ago, to an early American farm. If you lived in the country long ago, you and your family did most of the work necessary for survival right at home. The country is an area of land where homes are far away from one another, and most of the land is made up of farms. In the country, houses were far apart from one another, so you couldn't rely on neighbors or stores to get everything you needed. You had to make most things at home. Everything you needed, food to eat, water to drink or use for cooking and cleaning, lighting to help you see after dark, heat when it turned cold, and clothing required a lot of work by the family. Even young children had to help out because there was so much work to do. There was no electricity for lamps or lights, and there were no flashlights. The only way to see anything after it got dark was to light candles that you made at home. This lady down here is making candles. There were no electric ovens or stoves like we have today. So you had to build a fire to heat your home and cook your meals, like we have in kitchens and bathrooms today. There were no sinks or faucets with running water inside the house. like we have in kitchens and bathrooms today. So you had to fetch any water you needed for drinking, cooking, or cleaning from the nearby creek or the well outside. There were no malls with clothing stores, so you had to make your own clothes. There were no supermarkets, so you had to grow your own vegetables, milk your own cows, and make your own cheese. Imagine doing all that work every day. At the start of a typical day in the country, the first thing a woman did was fetch wood to start the fire in the hearth or fireplace. The hearth was the most important place in the home. Most of the chores to be done required fire, and especially in the winter, everyone needed to stay close to the hearth because it provided the only heat in the house. After building the fire, a country woman would most likely start her day by baking bread. Sometimes she would make her own flour by grinding corn kernels or wheat into a fine powder. Then she would mix this flour and water with yeast and let it rise for several hours. The dough would then be put into an iron pot with a tight lid and hung over the hearth. Can you see the dough in this picture? Right here is the dough to bake or to cook. One task that had to be done twice a day, no matter what, was milking the cows. This task took a long time and was usually left for the children to do. Once the milk was collected, the milk that was not drunk was either made into cheese or butter. Making cheese involved a slow process of boiling and cooling the milk to produce curds or clumps of soured milk that look sort of like cottage cheese. These curds were pressed into forms to make the cheese. To make butter, milk was left to sit until the fatty cream floated to the top. Then the cream was poured into a tall wooden container called a churn. Today, we still use the word churn to mean mix. A child usually had to pump the handle of the butter churn, called the dasher, up and down for a long time until the fat and the cream separated into butter. The leftover liquid, called buttermilk, was used for cooking or drinking. People in the country ate mostly vegetables and grains. They only ate meat if the men or nearby neighbors had butchered or killed for food one of their animals. Because there were no refrigerators, the meat had to be preserved so it would not spoil or go bad. This was done by hanging it in strips above the fire or in a separate shed like this one called a smokehouse. The smoke from the fire dried out the meat, which prevented spoiling. The fire kept the meat from going bad. Beef jerky is an example of dried out, smoked meat. Other foods were preserved by covering them in salt, canning them, or storing them in a cool, dark cellar. Canning is sealing food tightly in jars so no air can get in. After all those chores were done, it was time for the sewing. In colonial times, women had to make their own thread and cloth before they could sew anything. Men and boys picked cotton from the fields or sheared the sheep or cut the wool off the sheep. And women cleaned and dyed this cotton or wool. To dye cotton or wool means to color it. Then women made the cotton or wool into thread or yarn. After that, they would weave the yarn into cloth to be used for clothing. To weave means to combine thread or yarn to make cloth. Girls were taught to sew and weave usually before the age of 10 so they could help make their own clothes. Because it was so much work to make clothes and so expensive to buy new clothes in town, much of the sewing work was patching or fixing old clothes that had become worn out and had holes or tears. Because children were expected to help out with every one of the chores, they did not have a lot of time for play. Do you get time to play daily? Many of you said yes. In colonial times, children had very little time to play, if any. The few toys they had, they usually made themselves. Sometimes girls made dolls like these out of parts of corn plants, and sometimes boys carved small toys out of wood. Most boys worked the farm alongside their fathers, taking over the family farm when they became older. If the family lived near a large town, some boys only lived at home until they were 11 or 12 years old. Then they were expected to learn a trade or a job that uses special skills, knowledge, and tools. Each boy would become an apprentice for several years, working with a master tradesperson in town to learn his job. A tradesperson is an expert in a trade and is the person who trains an apprentice. The country family in colonial times worked hard every day. Sometimes a trip into town was a welcome relief or break from their daily tasks. In town, the family was able to trade or buy things they needed so they could save the time and effort it took to make them. In the next read aloud, you will hear about what happened when a farmer took a trip into town. In colonial times, what kind of chores did children who lived on the farm have to do? Those children had to prepare food, make clothes, and milk the cows. What was the farm we heard about in the read aloud a farm that existed a long time ago or one that exists today? The farm in the read aloud existed a long time ago. How can you tell? They didn't have electricity or running water or machines. They made everything themselves. Was the farm we heard about today in town or in the country? It was in the country. Name one way the country was different from towns. Some ways that the country was different from towns was that the houses were far apart. The people in the read aloud had animals to take care of, and they grew their own crops. Long ago, there was no electricity. What did farmers use for light to see at night? They used candles that they made. Long ago, there were no furnaces to heat the houses. What did people use to warm their homes? They used a wood fire and a hearth or fireplace. What else was the hearth used for? It was used for cooking. Long ago, there were no sinks or faucets with running water inside the house. How did people get water? They got water from a well or a nearby creek. Long ago, there were no grocery stores. Where did milk and eggs come from? They came from cows and chickens. Where did cheese and butter come from? People made them from milk. Long ago, it was very expensive to buy clothes. How did people get clothes? They picked cotton and sheared wool from sheep. They dyed or colored it, made thread and yarn, wove it into cloth, and sewed clothes. Mrs. Johnston hopes you enjoyed our very first story in our new unit called The Country Family.